Hubungan bilateral Indonesia-Australia telah terjalin sejak 1949. Memasuki usia 74 tahun, kedua negara berkomitmen untuk meningkatkan perannya dalam mengembangkan ekonomi kawasan, khususnya di Indo-Pasifik. Langkah itu dilakukan guna memastikan kemakmuran kedua negara serta keterlibatan ekonomi strategis di masa mendatang. Untuk mengetahui lebih lanjut perkembangan hubungan bilateral kedua negara, Bisnis mewawancarai Duta Besar Australia untuk Indonesia, Penny Williams. Berikut tayangannya.
So I think, as you said, that the bilateral relationship between Australia and Indonesia is very, very strong. I was so lucky that I was able to join Bapak Presiden and my Prime Minister in Sydney last month for their annual leaders meeting. And they talked a lot about economic cooperation. Both of them are very focused on really increasing our strategic economic engagement. But they also talked about people-to-people links, and they talked about the relationships in education, human resources development, training. They also talked about visas and how we could facilitate greater business contact between Australia and Indonesia, and also amongst young people. So I'm really excited about where the bilateral relationship is at the moment, and the commitment of both leaders to really drive the relationship forward. I think the relationship is really strong. It's got very strong fundamentals. We have very strong, what we would say in diplomatic terms, architecture. So we have we're comprehensive strategic partners, but we also have IA-CEPA, which is the economic agreement that's been in force since July 2020. So we've got really strong pieces of architecture, and both sides are really committed to driving it forward. But as you said in your introduction, a real key to the future to ensure the prosperity of both of our people and an enduring relationship is really driving that economic engagement much more. And I think, as I said, both leaders are very committed to that. And we saw some fantastic outcomes in Sydney last month. As I said, Australia announced that we would extend the period of validity of business visas to 5 years, so that a business person applying for a visa to Australia now has a validity of 5 years. There was also some announcements around Australian universities established in Indonesia. So the President and the Prime Minister have a very ambitious agenda together, and it's really exciting to be part of that. You talked about batteries, EVs. Obviously that's an area of particular cooperation, and following the conversation between the President and the Prime Minister, our Australian Minister for Industry and Science visited Indonesia just last week to talk about opportunities for taking that forward. So I would, in a sense, I would characterise the relationship as being very in a very strong place, and a commitment on both sides to think about what strategic economic engagement looks like into the future. So I think in terms of what Australian companies are interested in Indonesia, and what we're seeing is, I mentioned education. We already have Monash University here as the first foreign university, and now we'll have 3 more: Deakin University in Bandung, Western Sydney in Surabaya, and Central Queensland in Blak-Blakan, with a node in Nusantara. So education and the transformation of Indonesia's education is something that we both work together on. Health is another area. Sanusa Medica is building 25 hospitals in West Java in a JV with the government of West Java. That's another area where Indonesia is looking for transformation and looking for Australia's sort of Australian investment in that area. So there's a lot happening in that space, but also in green, clean energy, renewables. There's a lot of interest. both in Indonesian companies looking at Australia and Australian companies looking at Indonesia. I think the most critical point in all of this, though, is to see it not just as us selling each other things, but how do we establish supply chains, strategic economic engagement, where we invest in each other's economies, where a company might invest in something in Australia that has input into production in Indonesia, and vice versa. And I think that's the exciting part of the relationship. Services, we often think about things about goods, but the services, trade in services is also quite important. You export tourism to us. At about 1.3 million Australians visit Indonesia every year out of a population of 27 million. As 1.3, that's a significant contribution to the Indonesian economy. Indonesian students study in Australia, so that's also trade in services. But I can see a lot of interest on both sides of that strategic investment, looking at the new economy, digital. What does digital transformation look like? Indonesian investment into digital in Australia is a particular area of interest, and always mining resources as well. So I have a sense of a lot of momentum in terms of, and a lot of excitement on the part of the business community. Last year at the B20, the Prime Minister was also at the G20 and spoke at the B20. We had the largest business delegation at the B20 was from Australia. We've had our institutional investors, our superannuation, our pension funds, we have about $3 trillion under funds under management, have also visited Indonesia to look at what the opportunities are. So there's quite a lot of excitement in Australia about the opportunities in Indonesia. And similarly, Indonesian companies are investing in Australia. So actually, as I said at the beginning, we have these two really important pieces of architecture: comprehensive strategic partnership, which has quite a detailed work plan, and then also IA-CEPA. I don't think that we actually need more architecture. I think that even things in the new economy are covered by those. The challenge is to really implement, and that's what our leaders are asking us to do. We've got the pieces of paper, we've got the plans. Goods from Indonesia enter tariff-free into Australia. We've got a lot of architecture, and now we actually have to drive it forward. So I don't think that we actually need a further piece, another agreement. We've got the agreements there. Now it's just a matter of getting things done. But and both, as I said, I mean, mobility is a really important part of it. And as I said, the Australian government's decision to increase the period of validity of business visas from Indonesia to 5 years is one of those sort of significant game changers that we can see. And we'll also look at new opportunities, both of us, under those two pieces of architecture. I was really pleased that the leaders also announced that there would be 10 scholarships for Indonesian students who were at Monash University in Indonesia to study something relevant to the development of the new capital, Nusantara. So maybe they could take a master's in urban design or a master's in cyber. So those sorts of things we're able to do under the architecture that we already have. So in September this year, so that's next month actually, so there's a huge trade fair that Indonesia organises, Mining Indonesia, and I think we've got 22 companies coming from Australia in the MET sector, so some of the mining, equipment, technology and services, quite a lot of interest in those sort of sectors in Indonesia. Then in September we'll have the ASEAN Summit, and there'll be some business events on the margins of those, and I expect once again to have a lot of Australian interest in participating in those events as well. So as I said, there is a lot of interest in investment in Indonesia. The sectors that jump out are education and health. And that's because Indonesia is going through a transformation in those sectors, and just the population base means that there's room there for Australian companies to bring expertise into the market. Vocational education is incredibly important. Indonesia, as you said at the outset, is looking at how it develops its workforce going forward as it moves to a developed country status. So those sectors are very important to us. But clean energy is another one. And in fact, during the meeting in Sydney of the President and the Prime Minister, they announced we have a $200 million climate change and infrastructure program, and they announced the first tranche, which is $50 million, which is used to leverage financing of Indonesian small and medium-sized enterprises working in the green energy and climate change field. So there's a lot of interest in looking at renewables. How do we do things differently? And interestingly, the same on the part of Indonesian companies, as I said, looking at Australia, like what is it that in renewables, what's happening in the digital space? So very much what I would call the new economy. And it's a fantastic opportunity. And of course, Australia is also interested in downstreaming. Any country that has access to the raw materials that Indonesia does, and Australia looks at their own domestic policy settings to leverage that. But I do, as the President and the Prime Minister agreed, we do need to look at strategically at the ways that we can cooperate and where are the particular areas in terms of bringing our industries together, which is why we had the visit of the Minister of Industry and Science last week. There's a lot of private sector interest on both sides, so it's not just completely government-led. Businesses are looking at each other's markets. It's interesting in terms of what Indonesia's looking at is, in terms of reducing emissions, really focused on electric vehicles for this market and potentially for export. What Australia's looking at domestically for us is batteries, so that we can push electricity into our electricity grid and to sort of stabilise transmission. So we're actually both sort of looking for different things in our domestic markets, and that does provide an opportunity for collaboration. So each state and territory has different sets of incentives. It's not dealt with at the Commonwealth level. When I visited Australia earlier in the year and did a business mission around Australia, talking about the opportunities in Indonesia, and really it depends on the particular state. So Western Australia is very focused on mining and agriculture, and so when Indonesian investors look at mining and agriculture, they tend to look at WA, Tasmania. I'm from Tasmania, small state in the south. I mean, that's really about maritime and hydroelectricity, because Tasmania had been generated by hydroelectricity for a long time. It has a target of 200% renewables, so not just sustaining itself but also pushing electricity into the grid. So really looking at different areas, different states, what their particular expertise is where Indonesian investors are also business people think about the particular sort of speciality of an area, where's the value add. And I also mentioned digital as well. There's quite a bit of interest in working in Australia on digital. So I've been here almost 2.5 years, and when I arrived in the middle of the pandemic, I did very much have that sense of what we really need to drive is economic engagement, strategic economic engagement. It was pretty tough during the pandemic. People couldn't move, but the moment the borders were reopened, we have just seen this incredible excitement in both Indonesia and Australia about making the most of IA-CEPA. Actually, how do we drive that? How can we achieve things? So I hope that in the next couple of years we just continue to see that increased interest in investment, the increased interest in strategic engagement. And I should say, as part of that, that builds also greater people-to-people links and relationships between our two people, which is fundamental to the relationship going forward and fundamental to prosperity in Indonesia and prosperity in Australia.